In the basement of St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, 41 human hearts were discovered in glass jars, still beating in preserving fluid. Each jar bore a patient's name, a date from 1853, and the signature of one man, Dr. Aldrich Blackwood. The year was 1853. Victorian London was a city of contrasts. Gleaming carriages rolled past gutters flowing with sewage, while gas lamps cast dancing shadows on cobblestone streets slick with rain and something darker. It was an age of medical revolution, where ambitious doctors pushed the boundaries of science, often with little regard for the lives hanging in the balance. But even in this era of questionable medical ethics, what happened within the walls of St. Bartholomew's Hospital would shock the medical establishment to its core. Picture, if you will, the narrow, fog-shrouded streets of Smithfield, where the ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's Hospital rose like a fortress against the London sky. Founded in 1123, Barts had witnessed nearly 8 centuries of human suffering and healing. By 1853, its Gothic towers and arched windows had seen plague, fire, and revolution, but they had never seen anything like Dr. Aldrich Blackwood. Blackwood arrived at St. Bartholomew's in the winter of 1852, his reputation preceding him like a cold wind. A brilliant anatomist and surgeon educated at Edinburgh, he possessed what his colleagues described as an almost supernatural understanding of the human form. His eyes, pale blue and unsettling, seemed to see through flesh and bone to the very essence of life itself. The hospital's administrators welcomed him with open arms. London's poor were dying in unprecedented numbers from cholera, typhus, and consumption. They needed a doctor who wasn't squeamish, who could make the hard decisions that others couldn't. They needed someone who could save lives at any cost. They had no idea what that cost would be. Dr. Blackwood was a man of peculiar habits. He arrived at the hospital each morning at precisely 4:47 a.m., always wearing the same black coat that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His hands, witnesses would later recall, were impossibly pale and cold to the touch, as if the warmth of life had drained from them long ago. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Nurses learned not to question his methods. Orderlies learned not to look too closely at what he did behind closed doors. And patients learned to fear the sound of his footsteps approaching their beds. The London of 1853 was a city in the grip of medical crisis. The Industrial Revolution had packed millions into cramped, unsanitary conditions. Disease spread through the narrow streets like wildfire, and the city's hospitals were overwhelmed. Traditional medicine was failing, and desperate times called for desperate measures. It was in this atmosphere of crisis that Dr. Blackwood began his work. He claimed to have developed revolutionary new surgical techniques that could cure previously incurable diseases. His methods were unconventional, he admitted, but the results spoke for themselves. And at first, they did. Patients arrived at St. Bartholomew's dying, and they left changed. Not cured exactly, but transformed in ways that defied medical understanding. They moved differently, spoke differently, as if something fundamental about their humanity had been altered. The hospital's mortality rate dropped dramatically. Other doctors marveled at Blackwood's success. Medical journals began to take notice. But those who looked closely, really looked closely, began to notice something else. The patients who survived Dr. Blackwood's treatments were never quite the same. They exhibited strange behaviors. spoke in monotones and seemed to have lost something essential to their humanity. More disturbing still, they all bore identical surgical scars in the same precise location over their hearts. Before we dive deeper into this tale of medical horror, I want to hear from you. What state are you watching from? Are you brave enough to continue this journey into the darkest corners of medical history? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to explore more mysteries that history tried to bury. But to understand the full horror of what Dr. Blackwood was doing to his patients, we need to examine the evidence that was hidden for over a century. Evidence that would reveal the true nature of his miraculous cures and the price his patients paid for their lives. The truth, as it always does, began with a single witness brave enough to speak. The first crack in Dr. Blackwood's carefully constructed facade came from an unexpected source, a night porter named Thomas Grimsby, whose job it was to clean the hospital's lower levels, where few dared to venture after dark.
Thomas had worked at St. Bartholomew's for over 2 decades. He'd seen death in all its forms, had mopped blood from operating theaters, and had carried more bodies to the morgue than he cared to count. But nothing had prepared him for what he discovered in the sub-basement on the night of March 15, 1853. In his own words, recorded years later by investigators, Thomas described what he saw. "I was making my rounds, just as I had every night for 20 years. But there was something different about the air that night. It felt thick, almost alive. As I descended the stairs to the lowest level, I heard sounds that no Christian soul should ever hear. Moaning, yes, but not the moaning of the sick. This was different, like the sound of someone trying to speak without breath in their lungs." Thomas's hand trembled as he reached for the door to the sub-basement storage room. The moaning grew louder, more desperate. When he turned the handle and stepped inside, the flickering light of his oil lamp revealed a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his days. 41 glass jars lined the wall of the storage room, each one roughly the size of a human head. But these weren't ordinary specimen jars. Each one pulsed with a rhythmic, hypnotic beat. Inside each jar, suspended in a clear preserving fluid, was a human heart. And impossibly, terrifyingly, they were still beating. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Each jar bore a brass nameplate with a patient's name, a date from the past few months, and the signature of Dr. Aldrich Blackwood. Thomas recognized some of the names, patients who had left the hospital cured of their ailments, walking out on their own 2 feet. Yet here were their hearts, still beating in glass prisons, while the people who should have died without them walked the streets of London. Thomas's discovery raised questions that challenged everything the medical establishment thought they knew about life and death. How could a person survive without their heart? What had Dr. Blackwood replaced these vital organs with? And most disturbing of all, if these hearts were still beating, were the patients who had left the hospital truly alive, or were they something else entirely? The night porter's first instinct was to report his findings immediately, but as he stood there watching the hearts beat in their glass prisons, he heard footsteps on the stairs above. Slow, deliberate footsteps that he recognized instantly. Dr. Blackwood was making his midnight rounds. Thomas quickly extinguished his lamp and pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft scratch of something being dragged across the stone floor. Through the crack in the door, Thomas watched as Dr. Blackwood descended into the basement, carrying what appeared to be a medical bag in one hand and something large and dark in the other. The doctor moved with the confidence of someone who had made this journey many times before. He approached the wall of jars with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. What Thomas witnessed next would form the foundation of an investigation that would shake Victorian London to its core. Dr. Blackwood opened his medical bag and removed a series of instruments that glinted in the moonlight filtering through the basement windows. But these weren't ordinary surgical tools. They were crafted from what appeared to be silver and inscribed with symbols that seemed to move and writhe in the flickering light. The doctor began to chant in a language that Thomas didn't recognize, something ancient and guttural that seemed to make the very air around him vibrate. As he chanted, the hearts in their jars began to beat faster, more urgently, as if responding to his voice. One by one, Dr. Blackwood approached each jar, touching the glass with his pale fingertips. At his touch, the heart seemed to glow with an inner light, and Thomas could swear he heard whispers coming from within the preserving fluid, the voices of the patients whose hearts had been taken. Thomas remained hidden until Dr. Blackwood completed his ritual and departed. Only then did he dare to approach the jars for a closer look. What he saw there convinced him that Dr. Blackwood was not practicing medicine at all, but something far more sinister. Each heart bore markings, not surgical scars, but symbols carved directly into the cardiac tissue, the same symbols that had been etched into the doctor's silver instruments. And as Thomas watched in horror, he realized that these weren't just preserved organs. They were still alive, still conscious, still aware of what had been done to them. The next morning, Thomas Grimsby made a decision that would change everything. He would risk his job, his reputation, and possibly his life to expose what Dr. Blackwood was really doing to his patients. But first, he needed to understand the full scope of the horror he had witnessed.
He needed to investigate the patients who had been cured. The fog that perpetually shrouded London's streets seemed thicker than usual as Thomas Grimsby began his investigation. Armed with the list of names from the 41 jars, he set out to find the patients who had supposedly been cured by Dr. Blackwood's revolutionary treatments. What he discovered would challenge everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the nature of human existence. The first name on his list was Margaret Whitmore, a seamstress from Whitechapel who had been admitted to St. Bartholomew's with advanced consumption. According to the hospital records, she had been discharged fully recovered after a single treatment from Dr. Blackwood. Thomas found her in the same cramped tenement where she had lived before her illness, but the woman who answered the door was not the Margaret Whitmore he remembered from her admission papers. The Margaret who stood before him was pale, impossibly pale, with skin that seemed to have a translucent quality, as if she were made of wax rather than flesh. Her eyes, once warm brown, had turned a disturbing shade of gray. She moved with mechanical precision, each gesture calculated and devoid of the natural fluidity of human movement. "How are you feeling, Margaret?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head at an unnatural angle, studying him with those gray eyes. When she spoke, her voice was monotone, devoid of any emotion. "I am well. Dr. Blackwood has made me well. I no longer feel pain. I no longer feel anything." As Thomas continued his investigation, he discovered that Margaret's condition was not unique. Every patient on his list exhibited the same disturbing characteristics: the pale, translucent skin, the gray eyes, the mechanical movements, and most unsettling of all, the complete absence of human emotion. They worked at their jobs with tireless efficiency, never needing rest or food. They spoke when spoken to, but their responses were always the same:
Dr. Blackwood has made me well. But there were other signs, more subtle but equally disturbing. None of the patients cast shadows in sunlight. Mirrors seemed to reflect their images incompletely, as if they were only partially present in the physical world. And when Thomas listened carefully, really listened, he could hear something that chilled him to the bone. They had no heartbeat. Determined to understand what Dr. Blackwood had done to these people, Thomas began to follow them during their daily routines. What he observed defied all natural law. At night, when normal people slept, the cured patients would gather in small groups in abandoned buildings throughout London. They would stand in circles, motionless and silent, for hours at a time. But if you listened closely, you could hear something, a faint, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from somewhere far away. It was the sound of their hearts, still beating in Dr. Blackwood's basement laboratory. Thomas's breakthrough came when he encountered James Morrison, a dock worker who had been treated for a severe chest injury. Unlike the others, James seemed to retain some fragment of his former self. When Thomas approached him in a tavern near the docks, James's gray eyes flickered with something that might have been recognition. "You're from the hospital," James said, his voice slightly less monotone than the others. "You've seen them, haven't you? The jars." Thomas nodded, afraid to speak. James leaned closer, and Thomas could see something struggling behind those gray eyes, a remnant of the man he had once been. "He takes more than your heart. He takes your soul, traps it in glass and fluid, while your body walks the earth, empty and hollow." "But why?" Thomas asked. "What purpose does it serve?" James's face contorted with effort, as if he were fighting against invisible restraints. "Power," he managed to say. "Life force. He's building something, an army of the soulless. And when he has enough—" James's voice trailed off as his eyes went fully gray again. The moment of clarity was gone. Through careful observation and documentation, Thomas began to understand the horrific scope of Dr. Blackwood's experiments. The doctor wasn't just removing hearts. He was extracting the very essence of what made his patients human, trapping their souls in glass prisons while their bodies became vessels for something else entirely. The 41 patients were just the beginning. Dr. Blackwood was systematically processing the sick and dying of London, turning them into an army of soulless automatons. But for what purpose? The truth is more terrifying than you might imagine. What's your theory about Dr. Blackwood's ultimate goal? Are you starting to piece together the horrifying reality of his experiments? Share your thoughts in the comments below, if you dare. As Thomas compiled his evidence, he realized that time was running out. Each night, more patients were admitted to St. Bartholomew's. Each morning, more cured individuals walked out into the streets of London. The city was slowly being populated by the soulless, and no one seemed to notice. But Thomas's investigation had not gone unnoticed. Dr. Blackwood was aware that someone was watching, someone was asking questions, and the good doctor had plans for anyone who threatened to expose his work. The confrontation between Thomas Grimsby and Dr. Blackwood was inevitable, but what the night porter discovered about the doctor's true nature would reveal a horror that stretched far beyond the walls of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. A horror that threatened not just London, but the very nature of human existence itself. The confrontation came on a night when London's fog was so thick that gaslight could barely penetrate the darkness. Thomas Grimsby had made his decision. He would gather irrefutable evidence of Dr. Blackwood's crimes and present it to the authorities. But as he descended into the basement of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, he had no idea that he was walking into a trap. Dr. Blackwood was waiting for him. "Mr. Grimsby," the doctor's voice echoed through the basement corridor, smooth and cold as winter ice. "I've been expecting you." Thomas froze, his oil lamp trembling in his hand. Dr. Blackwood emerged from the shadows, his pale eyes gleaming with an inner light that was decidedly not human. In the flickering lamplight, Thomas could see that the doctor's true nature was finally being revealed. Dr. Blackwood's skin had the same translucent quality as his patient's, but unlike them, he seemed to glow with an inner energy. His movements were fluid and predatory, like a spider approaching a trapped fly. Most disturbing of all, Thomas could see dark veins pulsing beneath the doctor's pale skin, as if something other than blood flowed through his body. "You've been quite industrious," Dr. Blackwood continued, stepping closer, "visiting my patients, asking questions. I must admit, I'm impressed by your dedication. It's a quality I can use." Thomas found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What are you?" Dr. Blackwood smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too white. "I am what you might call a collector, Mr. Grimsby. I collect the most precious thing in existence, the human soul. Each soul I harvest makes me stronger, more powerful. And London is full of souls just waiting to be collected." The doctor gestured toward the wall of jars, where 41 hearts continued their eternal, imprisoned beat. Each of these represents a life essence captured at the moment of greatest vitality. Their bodies continue to function, yes, but they are merely empty vessels now. The real treasure lies here, in my collection. As Thomas listened in horror, Dr. Blackwood revealed the true scope of his plan. He was not merely collecting souls for personal power, he was building something far more sinister. Each soul he captured was connected to the others, forming a network of consciousness that he could control at will. "Imagine," the doctor said, his eyes gleaming with fanatical fervor, "an army of the soulless, perfectly obedient, never tiring, never questioning. They would spread throughout London, then England, then the world, and I would be their master, controlling them through the souls I keep imprisoned here." But there was more. Dr. Blackwood explained that he was not working alone. He was part of an ancient society of individuals who had learned to extend their lives by consuming the life force of others. They had been operating in secret for centuries, but the industrial age had provided them with unprecedented opportunities. "Hospitals, Mr. Grimsby, wonderful inventions, places where the sick and dying come voluntarily, where no one questions a doctor's methods too closely. We have colleagues in Edinburgh, Paris, Berlin, all of us working toward the same goal." While Dr. Blackwood spoke, Thomas noticed something that the doctor seemed to have forgotten: a leather-bound journal lying open on a table. Even in the dim light, Thomas could see that it contained detailed records of every patient, every procedure, every soul that had been harvested. More importantly, the journal contained information about the other members of this secret society. Names, locations, methods, everything needed to expose the entire network. Thomas realized that this might be his only chance to gather the evidence needed to stop not just Dr. Blackwood, but the entire organization. But first, he had to survive the next few minutes. Dr. Blackwood had finished his exposition and was now approaching Thomas with clear, malevolent intent.
"Your soul will make a fine addition to my collection," the doctor said, producing one of his silver instruments. "I've got such determination, such strength of will. I can already taste the power you'll provide." Thomas knew he had only seconds to act. He hurled his oil lamp at the wall of jars, hoping to create a distraction. The lamp shattered against the stone wall, sending burning oil cascading across the floor. Several of the jars cracked, and the preserving fluid began to leak out. The effect was immediate and terrifying. As the fluid drained from the damaged jars, the hearts inside began to beat more frantically. The air filled with whispers, the voices of the trapped souls crying out for release. In that moment of chaos, Thomas discovered something crucial. Dr. Blackwood's power was tied directly to the preserved hearts. As the jars were damaged, the doctor seemed to weaken, his movements becoming less fluid, his predatory grace faltering. "You don't understand," Dr. Blackwood screamed, rushing to save his collection. "If these are destroyed, the souls will be released, the network will collapse." Thomas realized that he had found the key to stopping the doctor's plan, but he also understood the terrible cost. Releasing the souls would likely kill the soulless patients who still walked the streets of London. Faced with an impossible choice, Thomas hesitated. Could he condemn 41 people to death to save potentially thousands more? Was it right to make such a decision? But as he watched Dr. Blackwood frantically trying to save his collection, Thomas heard something that made his decision for him. The whispers from the leaking jars had become clearer, and he could make out words. "Please, release us. We cannot rest. Trapped so long." The souls themselves were begging for freedom, even at the cost of their physical existence. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Dr. Blackwood and his victims, but the future of London itself. Thomas Grimsby stood in that basement laboratory, surrounded by the sounds of beating hearts and whispered pleas for release, and made the most difficult decision of his life. He grabbed a heavy iron bar from the maintenance supplies and began systematically smashing the jars that contained the imprisoned souls. The effect was immediate and devastating. As each jar shattered, releasing its preserving fluid and freeing the heart within, a pulse of energy rippled through the air. Dr. Blackwood screamed, not in anger, but in agony, as his carefully constructed network of stolen souls began to collapse. Throughout London, the soulless patients who had been walking the streets suddenly stopped where they stood. Margaret Whitmore, the seamstress from Whitechapel, was found the next morning in her tenement room, finally at peace. James Morrison, the dock worker, collapsed on the waterfront, with a smile on his lips for the first time since his cure. All 41 patients died that night, but witnesses reported that they seemed to welcome death like an old friend. Their final moments were marked not by pain, but an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude. Dr. Blackwood, meanwhile, was experiencing his own transformation. As his collection of souls was destroyed, the unnatural life force that had sustained him began to drain away. His pale skin grew paler still, becoming almost transparent. His movements became jerky and uncoordinated. "You have no idea what you've done," he gasped, his voice now barely a whisper. "The others, they will continue the work. London is just the beginning." But Thomas was no longer listening. He had found Dr. Blackwood's journal and was reading the horrifying details of the soul harvesting network. Names, locations, methods, everything needed to expose the entire conspiracy. The journal revealed that Dr. Blackwood was part of a society that called itself the Collectors. They had been operating for centuries, moving from city to city, hospital to hospital, harvesting souls to extend their own unnatural lives. London was just their latest hunting ground. The journal contained correspondence with other members of the society in Edinburgh, Paris, Berlin, and even New York. They were planning to expand their operations to build armies of the soulless in every major city in the world. But now Thomas had the evidence needed to stop them. As the last jar shattered, Dr. Blackwood let out one final scream that seemed to echo from somewhere far beyond the physical world. His body crumpled to the floor, and as Thomas watched, it began to crumble like ancient parchment, turning to dust that was swept away by the cold basement air. All that remained was his black coat and the silver instruments, which had lost their unnatural glow and now appeared to be nothing more than ordinary surgical tools. Thomas took the journal and fled the hospital, going directly to Scotland Yard. But when he returned with the authorities, they found nothing but an empty basement and the remnants of broken glass. The bodies of the 41 patients had vanished, and there was no trace of Dr. Blackwood. Not even his dust remained. The authorities were skeptical of Thomas's story, but the journal provided undeniable evidence. A secret investigation was launched, and within months, several members of the Collectors were arrested in cities across Europe.
However, the full truth was never revealed to the public. The authorities decided that the story was too disturbing, too unbelievable to be released. The official records were sealed, and Thomas Grimsby was sworn to secrecy. The basement of St. Bartholomew's Hospital was permanently sealed, and the hospital's administrators claimed it was due to structural concerns. To this day, no one is allowed to enter that basement level. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Thomas made the right choice? Was he justified in condemning 41 people to death to save potentially thousands more? And what about the other members of the Collectors? Do you think they're still out there, continuing their work in secret? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thomas Grimsby lived with the weight of his decision for the rest of his life. He never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed, but those who knew him said that he was a changed man. He would often stare at his reflection in mirrors, as if checking to make sure he still cast a shadow. In his final years, Thomas confided to a trusted friend that he sometimes wondered if he had truly stopped Dr. Blackwood's work, or if he had simply disrupted one small part of a much larger, more sinister network. The truth is, we may never know. The journal Thomas recovered mentioned dozens of other collectors operating around the world. Some were arrested, others disappeared, but the society itself was never completely eradicated. So the next time you find yourself in a hospital, particularly an old one with a long history, remember the story of Dr. Blackwood and his collection of souls. Look carefully at the doctors who treat you. Study their eyes, their movements, their bedside manner. Ask yourself, are they truly trying to heal you? Or are they seeing something else entirely when they look at you? Something that glows with the light of life itself. And if you find yourself in London, walking past St. Bartholomew's Hospital on a foggy night, you might want to listen carefully. Some say that if you stand very still and listen with your heart rather than your ears, you can still hear the faint sound of beating hearts coming from somewhere deep beneath the ancient stones. 41 hearts that found peace at last, but whose story serves as a warning to us all about the darkness that can lurk behind the face of healing. The question that haunts us still is this: in our modern age of medical miracles and technological wonders, how would we recognize a Dr. Blackwood if we encountered one? How would we know if the cure we're being offered comes at the cost of our very soul? Some questions are more terrifying than any answer. Thank you for watching. If this story has left you questioning the nature of healing and the price of medical miracles, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. What other dark chapters of medical history would you like us to explore? The shadows of the past are full of stories that refuse to stay buried.